The next speaker is Anna Lawrence, and she's a first-year graduate, well, now second-year graduate student here. And she's going to be talking about an acoustic study that she did on heritage languages. She is also a heritage language speaker, right?
Yes,
Yeah. Her mother is from Spain, so without further ado, here she is.
Right. Hello. So after discussing what constitutes a heritage speaker, it kind of opens up a good transition into this study, which is looking at one of the more understudied aspects of what we would define as heritage Spanish speakers as language. So for this study, I'm presenting the results of a pilot study on heritage and, as I've defined them, L1 Spanish vowel spaces. So presenting acoustic evidence for some issues that can tie into social and phonological contrasts between heritage Spanish speakers and people that we would identify as native and monolingual speakers of Spanish. So for this talk, one of our broader goals is to address the void in literature on heritage Spanish phonology as it compares to that of monolingual Spanish speakers, which Rao and Ronquest identified several different realms in which this has been unexplored in their paper. But also we want to investigate the nature of a native versus heritage phonology as a language contact phenomenon rather than as a matter of Spanish proficiency or deficiency, which could be presumed controversial. But for the most part, identifying these as differences and what their social impacts can be rather than to say that it's a deficiency. Because for the most part, the theme of Spanish heritage phonology has been identified as one of the least targetable elements of their language, at least in the classroom. Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on the differences between the average vowel formant frequencies and the overall vowel spaces, as you'll see in your standard classroom chart of A, E, I, O, U in the Spanish, of native speakers as I've identified them in this study, and then a group of heritage speakers in an emerging community of the United States. And so with these results, we want to tie those differences to current issues that are being talked about in the language of heritage Spanish speakers, foremost identity and the repercussions that can come about as having contrastive features in the phonology as opposed to a native Spanish speaker. So as far as why we're examining this community and this group, we'll see in a moment that this study was done in a community of eastern North Carolina, which is actually a very recently emerging bilingual population. Much of the study on heritage Spanish has been done in more historically established communities that have much larger Spanish-speaking populations that have come to form their own identity and history over the years. But this population is sort of fueled by an increase in migrant working and in agriculture. And so it's really grown much more over the past few decades rather than to have been firmly established for a century or more. And so there is a growing bank of literature on these sorts of communities, including that of North Carolina Spanish. But most previous studies have focused on more urban communities in the state, such as Charlotte and Raleigh, and they haven't touched on differences that could impact the Spanish of heritage speakers and more rural bilingual populations in the state. So we're kind of presenting a bit different of a case than what has been done in other phonetic studies on this group. And so because of that, there is kind of a void in literature tying this feature of heritage Spanish phonology to the social issues that surround these speakers. And in the context of this community, I'll sort of discuss what the implications could be of being in a more fragmented and recently developed community and forming that sort of identity as opposed to a larger one. Okay, so this specific community, and I'll go through this, but has risen pretty dramatically over the past 2 decades. overall, people identifying as Hispanic don't constitute a huge part of the population in North Carolina, but 9% and then 17% of the total population of Hispanics in the U.S. is a significant change from what it has been previously. And North Carolina does hold the rank as the 11th largest Hispanic population in the United States. And so we can see sort of that the migration of Spanish-speaking people to North Carolina is being impacted by this agricultural activity. And so a lot of this growth that's occurring is actually happening in much more rural counties as opposed to the larger ones. So if you see on this map, the counties highlighted in purple, Sampson and Duplin and Lee counties are all fairly rural. But they actually they have the largest self-identifying Hispanic populations in the state. And also, this particular study was performed in Pitt County, which is one of the ones in yellow. It doesn't have quite as large a population, but if you look at the statistics from the Pew Hispanic Center here in the chart, you can see a significant change over time. And even though a growth from 4,000 to 10,000, may not appear that much in numbers, but really it has changed the linguistic landscape of that community, and you can see much more of a presence over the past couple of decades. So as far as the topic that we're exploring today goes, there have been numerous studies conducted in heritage Spanish phonology, even though it's often identified as an understudied theme. But as far as general studies comparing the vowel spaces, which is what we're examining today, between Spanish and English go, often it's been identified that monolingual Castilian Spanish, so nowhere near really the variety that we would be examining in this community, but still sort of serving as the informative standard for our knowledge of this phonological theme, is that their vowel space is much larger than the monolingual English vowel space, which is typically identified as more fluid and compressed. And then that, different Spanish-speaking communities in the United States display slightly different features as presumably impacted by language contact and dialectal contact. So for example, in this study by Grijalva and Piccinini, we find that the U and O phonemes were considered lower and more fronted as compared to the study by Bradlow comparing it with Castilian Spanish. Other studies that have been done on heritage speakers of Spanish in different areas of the country have also sort of found this effect. So Willis found a fronting of U and a lowering of O for heritage Spanish speakers in the Southwest United States. And we find that, generally, as summarized by Ronquest, that heritage Spanish speakers have been shown to display more condensed vowel spaces than their monolingual counterparts. Regardless, we still tend to identify these speakers as having an advantage in perceived nativeness by other monolingual Spanish speakers as compared to L2 learners, because since they're exposed to this phonology from an early age, they're more readily available to replicate that in conversation. And then in terms of more specifically the phonology of Spanish in North Carolina, where we're studying this, we've also found consistent patterns. So Boomershine found that this fronting of U and lowering of O in these urban populations was consistent with Willis's study, and that this vowel space does tend to pattern with that of native Spanish speakers in the area compared to L2 learners more so. So we're identifying that heritage Spanish speakers tend to gravitate phonologically more toward L1 learners, which is what we would expect based on results of other studies on different aspects of their language. But we're not focusing on what necessarily could be different between the two. And then Ronquest also found that, aside from these two other phonemes, we do tend to see a more centering of vowels, especially in lexically unstressed environments in the speech of these speakers. Okay. So for the current study, our questions are how these vowel spaces, so basically the acoustic evidence of the form and frequencies of each of these speakers is phonological vowels, a, e, o, u, differ between heritage and monolingual Spanish speakers in this community. What can those spaces reveal about the Spanish of this community in comparison with other bilingual communities? And then what are the implications of these findings toward the social backgrounds of heritage speakers in this community regarding issues such as their identities and their attitudes toward their own Spanish? Okay. So what we'll be examining today, although all these variables were considered in the actual analysis, are this distinction between monolingual and heritage Spanish speakers that we sampled in the study, and then the acoustic realization of each of the canonical vowels in their phonology. So this little triangle of the I, E, O, U. So in the methodology, we had to control for the environment by ensuring that all vowels occurred between stops and sibilants, or like in a mixed space. And then, of course, because it's a fairly small scale study, this was a pilot study, we have to also consider the individual speaker differences, although today we'll be generalizing a bit more between those groups. So the actual measurements that were taken were the vowels, were each vowel's F1 frequency, which reflects the vowel height, as we call it. So the high vowels, as identified in Spanish, are the E and the U. And then the vowel the F2 frequency, which reflects its backness. So for example, E is a front vowel and U is a back vowel. And so this reflects, of course, to the resonances of the of each vowel in the mouth space, and it will be graphed, but overall we plot it together. Okay. So the instruments for this study, all of the vowel tokens were taken from this corpus of Eastern North Carolina Spanish that was compiled between 2014 and 2016 in this region. That was done with both heritage Spanish speakers and native, either monolingual or very heavily Spanish dominant bilingual Spanish speakers that lived in the area. So all of them had to participate in a fairly unstructured sociolinguistic interview. They did all do a more targeted narration of this frog story, as we call it, by Meyer, which is pictured on the right. And then they did all complete this bilingual language profile questionnaire, which was basically used to assess their language dominance. So the BLP, which we'll see here in the participant makeup, generates this composite score that indicates, based on questions about their attitudes, their proficiency, their history in the language, how either Spanish dominant or English dominant they are. So here's a list of the 6 participants whose Spanish were analyzed. You'll see that 3 of them were identified as heritage and 3 of them were identified as monolingual. And all of the monolingual ones are fairly heavily in the, yes, okay, positive Spanish score is Spanish dominant. So those that are in the 100-something range, it means that they're pretty fairly Spanish dominant, versus closer to 0 would be a bit more balanced bilingual. So we tried to distribute for that, and in terms of the actual makeup of group membership for this study, it had to do with how we recruited these participants. So there are, of course, many contrasting definitions of a heritage speaker, but all of the heritage speakers in this study, at least, shared the traits of having been born in the U.S. to Spanish-speaking parents. They all said that they acquired the language during childhood and they grew up speaking in the home. Furthermore, the monolingual speakers had been born, all of them for this study were born in Mexico, and all of the heritage speakers were children of 2 Mexican parents, which doesn't control for regional dialect, but at least for a certain area. And the monolingual speakers had all completed schooling in a country other than the U.S., and the criteria for selection was 12 or older, but I believe that all of the monolingual participants in this study immigrated to the U.S. after age 18. So as far as analysis goes, all of the token collection for these vowels were collected from the prod software and were annotated in the text grid. So we recorded stressed vowel monophthongs, so selected between full stops or sibilant S. So either like both or a mixed environment. And so on the right, you can just see an example of a vowel token taken in rapid speech. And so it was all taken from the sociolinguistic interviews, which was intended to sort of elicit the more natural speech of these participants. But yeah, and so all of those tokens were then extracted for their formants using a prod script, which just delivered the F1 and F2 for each of the vowels that had been tagged this way. Okay. So for the results, 273 vowels were found total. Because of the nature of these interviews, you can't really predict which ones are going to come up in the environments that you're trying to control for acoustically, but we did at least get several dozen in each canonical vowel as far as the entire group went. And so if we break down the individual vowel spaces of each, the top row of I know that these are small, but the top row of these charts are the heritage speakers, and then the bottom row are the monolingual speakers. And first and foremost, we can basically see that there is a lot of variation, especially if you look at, for example, speaker 4, whose E is like very back compared to all of the others. Speaker 5's is a lot more neat, or actually it's much more fronted. So front vowels in this diagram are going to be on this side, and then back are going to be on the other. Yeah, you'll see that there is considerable variation even between them, but we can, if we just go and look at these groups presented side by side average-wise, we have some average frequencies for all of the heritage speakers taken together as opposed to the monolingual speakers, which, again, it's difficult to generalize about this group, but we can at least see that there is variation between the two. So for the heritage speaker group, we can see that U is observably more fronted than O in the vowel space, but not more so than the typically described front vowels of A and E. And then A, on average, has a pretty high F1, which makes it noticeably lower than the rest of the vowel space. So it's not quite what you would expect for this group. Whereas the monolingual form and frequency values for these L1 speakers, their average values for E are much more visibly fronted and lower than the additional 4 values, which could be skewed by one participant's space impacting the others, but we could see overall individually that they were different. And then U and A are of similar frontness, and then O is more fronted than A. So between groups, we can't really determine whether either speaker group is more condensed than another, but aside from E, which is very contrasted between the two groups, the L1 vowel space appears to be more centralized between the remaining 4 vowels than we see with the heritage speakers, which is actually not what we would expect from previous studies, which have found that heritage speakers tend to centralize more based on their impact with English, which tends to have a more fluid space. So this is a different finding than what was expected. And additionally, for these monolingual speakers, the O and the U are more fronted than that of the heritage speakers. And so here we just have them presented side by side. I did perform a factorial ANOVA in R that just compared this vowel speaker group interaction. It did find that across all vowels, there was a significant difference between F1, and then a bit less so with F2, but we can see that if we generalize these two groups, we see some significant differences. So as far as answering our research questions go, we wanted to see how these vowel spaces differed between these heritage and monolingual Spanish speakers in the community. And the differences according to the statistics that were performed were significant for F1 across this vowel space, and then findings for F2 in the same measurement were significant, albeit less so. That being said, A was the most stable vowel across these speakers in relation to the whole space, and then U and A were more lowered for heritage speakers compared to the monolingual group. So our findings for this study contrasted a bit from what had previously been found in other Hispanic communities in the US and what had been found with other heritage speakers as phonology. But right now with this group, we're kind of opening the way to investigate that further and figure out what this variation means, because really it's all going up to the individual variation, especially between these heritage speakers and their backgrounds. For the second question, how these vowel spaces can reveal certain things about the community, and this is important to discuss again because this sort of community is emerging and it's not quite as established. Therefore, each individual in it and all of any Hispanic families residing in it might not necessarily have as many contacts, as much interaction with each other, depending on where they're settling. And so we can see from the results of the study that there was a lot of individual variation between both the monolingual speakers and the heritage speakers in the study, because they came from different backgrounds and they had different self-reported levels of proficiency and interaction with the language. And even just based on observation and based on my own experience in this community, we can see that although there's increased visibility and there's much more participation in local business and everything, and there's more of a Hispanic presence than there was 20 years ago or so, this heritage Spanish speaker community is very possibly more isolated than it would be in an urban counterpart in the state. And then additionally, the monolingual speakers in this study may have been less impacted by any English context, because the individuals that were selected for the study were in professions that demanded less interaction with English speakers. And so not only is this maybe not even a contact phenomenon for them in terms of how their phonology is impacted in their vowels, but also they're retaining the characteristics that could be unique to the community that they came from in their home country. So we can't determine so far how much of their own variation is a result of their individual background or their residence in that community. So as far as the implications of these findings toward these broader social issues surrounding heritage communities and heritage speakers in the United States, so we can see that there's a relative lack of visibility in the Hispanic community in this region, that also alongside current political environments and the general political makeup of the area that they're in regard to foreignness, may be affecting these heritage speakers' use of Spanish outside their social circles that they mentioned in their interview. So we don't actually know how much they're interacting with each other compared to in other communities, and how much they're actually exercising their phonology outside of interactions with their families. And then because of this relative isolation, we don't know if this phonology is being more impacted by their English than in communities where bilingualism is going to be more visible. And furthermore, if as they get older, they're going to want to angle themselves more toward their English dominant identity than they are the Hispanic identity that they've grown up with. So we don't know how much their Spanish has also been impacted as they've grown. But the biggest point that I wanted to highlight was that this contrast between these speaker groups and then, of course, between individuals implies that heritage speakers don't have a phonology that is exactly the same, or at least the acoustic characteristics of their Spanish are not the same as that of L1 speakers that would be perceived as native-like. And we don't know how this is going to impact their identities, their confidence in speaking with other native speakers as they get older, or if they go back to their home country, their parents' country of origin, if they're going to be perceived as native-like. Because simply anecdotally, as a heritage speaker of Spanish, I grew up fairly confident of my phonology and was told that, you know, it was much better than like anyone in a Spanish class that I was going to take. But, you know, and even here I have regular interactions where somebody asks me, ¿De dónde eres en España? And like, you know, I tell them I'm not, I was born here. But as soon as you go back to your home country, people can tell as soon as you open your mouth. It's almost instant. And so even though, you know, you might have this sort of this confidence in your Spanish while you're here, even though you feel like your phonology is firmly established, it might impact the interactions that you have with other native speakers if you do go to another Spanish-speaking community. So it would be interesting to see in the future how this phonology impacts their hyphenated identities. And so with that, in the future, not only would it be good to examine this from a broader range, this being a pilot study, we could only look at a few speakers to sort of get an idea of what this looks like in this group, but it would be good to establish a greater range to see how this manifests. And then to see how the vowel spaces may differentiate between these speakers as English and Spanish. But the wave of study in heritage phonology right now is going more toward the speech rhythms and prosody of heritage speakers between their English and their Spanish. So right now, you know, when you do have an interaction with somebody as a heritage speaker who is a native speaker of Spanish, oftentimes it's that sort of, I can't identify why you don't sound native, but you just do. And that may be lying underneath the prosody, that underlying transfer of like your speech style and those cues that you use in your English may be transferring to your Spanish and, you know, impacting it with that cross. And so that would be the ideal direction to go into for future studies, as this was more of like a preliminary mapping of what this Spanish sounds like for these speakers. Furthermore, it would also be good to look at how other like native Spanish speakers perceive the nativeness of these heritage speakers as accents, to see what sort of thoughts are had toward these speakers and their inclusion in their heritage group or their parents' country of origins cultural group. And then furthermore, on a much more broader track would be, after getting more data on the actual acoustics behind these people's speech, it would be good to see the interaction between this phonology with the identity of these students once you can get a better background of what their Spanish actually looks like in terms of these vowels, their prosody, their speech rhythm, etc. And so just really quickly, there were several limitations, of course, to performing an acoustic study on only 6 speakers and then making generalizations about those groups, so that we did see a lot of variability between these speakers. And then furthermore, extracting the tokens from these sociolinguistic interviews meant that you couldn't quite control for the vowels that were going to come along. And so because of that, the distribution was a little off. But and then furthermore, this idea of lexical stress as being a factor in token selection is a little bit shifty, just because it's not, varying studies find whether there's actually that much of a difference in the vowel realization of lexically stressed vowels versus non-stressed vowels. And then additionally, there were other environments in which these vowels could have been coded to be controlled a bit more for the surrounding consonants. So, for example, with stop voicing, that was encoded in this study. Yeah. But other than that, that's all I have to say.
So thank you for your talk. I found it really interesting, and I was really interested in the way you were speaking as you were talking. I started listening to particularly your vocal fry.
Oh.
So, and I have a question then about, you're studying vowels, but what about like below the phoneme level? Has there been any work done in what's called phonation types, transferring from one, like, I was thinking about this I'm not in Spanish, but in French, and so among bilinguals in Canada, they're looking at English speakers and French speakers. So English speakers have the vocal fry, and do they transfer it? We're finding out, no, they don't.
They don't.
So it's an indexical that works only in their community, but not in the other.
I haven't seen studies that actually target that idea of vocal fry, but based on my own experience, I do feel like I've heard it in Spanish, like it, not even in like the heritage speech, but like say, like that sort of like confirmation, and so I know, but like as far as that contrast, I haven't seen it, but it would be interesting to explore.
So what I find so interesting, so it could be transferred, but it might have a different meaning than...
Absolutely. I could definitely see that.
That would be really interesting to look.
I know that the variances of the United States are quite varied, especially you have a more open vowel in the South than you do in the North and stuff. And so I wonder how that skews the results.
Yeah, no, and that's always taken into account with these studies, and that's why I think that they're always trying to like identify, okay, well, these are heritage vowels in Southwest Southwest American Spanish versus like Southern American. I'm not familiar with a study like necessarily comparing the two in a controlled environment where it was all done at once, but that would ideally be a way to be able to chart out what dialectal factors from the dominant language could be impacting their Spanish as well. So that's certainly something that is being looked into and is worth looking into, is to see like what's impacting what in that case.
My question is, what implications do you see in terms of how this might impact instruction for secondary teachers or even elementary teachers that work with students in either a bilingual or a dual language program, or even in just traditional high school courses?
Yeah, I'm honestly still trying to formulate that, because it's tough even to make the goal a native-like accent in the first place. And I think like one of the main challenges that could be associated with this is the confidence of that speaker in the classroom, and whether they're aware of those differences. Because as far as things like prosody, it's difficult to alter that. That's like, for example, one of my main challenges as a heritage speaker is transferring that sort of thing. So currently, I think like the broader idea of like making sure that they're comfortable using their Spanish and sort of associating their own Spanish as not something that necessarily has to approximate the standard, but maybe to be, or standard as far as like their target with the dialect that they've been exposed to, could be that route to take. But honestly, I feel like there's already probably debate about that as like what should they be aiming for. But yeah, I think as far as that goes, it's about it. The most important thing I think is like fostering that confidence.
I don't know how much interaction you might have had with the three heritage speakers, or did you get some sense from them about how first-generation speakers in their community perceive their Spanish, if there's some sort of concern about their pronunciation?
So I wish that had been an item in the interview at the time, because basically these interviews were done with a morphosyntactic angle when they were first performed, and then I went back and did this study because I would have very much liked to ask the same thing. I can tell you that even though I didn't include any recordings in this, that they sound like none of their phonologies were like seemingly off. Like their accents did sound, at least from my perspective as not a speaker of their dialect, like close to native-like, but I didn't get a lot of feedback. I got some on just like more identity-based differences or like differences between life in their parents' country of origin versus differences like in living in North Carolina and interacting that way. But I don't have any data right now with this community as far as their own perceptions of their accent go. So I wish I had did though.
And do you know why the I or the E does what it does?
I do not at this point. Yeah, I have to look at more of them to figure it out. But especially the interaction with the surrounding dialect is interesting, and like whether they identify their English dialect, for example, as being a Southern American one, or maybe one that's more like Chicano influenced. So that's also another thing to take into account, basically, with this study, which is why we need more people and more questions.